$60 from you?
Burl Kessick's voice cracked across the yard. He turned to the crowd, bloated red neck glistening, fat finger aimed at the thin black man crouched beside a rusted sealed crate.
$60 for a box nobody can open.
He grinned.
Only a fool pays money for what he'll never see inside.
The crowd laughed because Burl laughed first. He stepped closer.
Go back to your dirt field, Scarecrow. You don't belong here!
Leland Garris did not lift his eyes. His hand stayed flat on the welded seam.
I know what I'm buying in.
But the sealed crate the whole town mocked held something that would drag the Kessick name into a courtroom. And by morning, the fool they laughed at would be the only man still standing. That morning, before the auction, before the laughter, before any of it, Leland Garris sat on the porch of his farmhouse with a cup of black coffee steaming between his hands and watched the October fog pull itself apart over the soybean field. He did this every morning. Same chair, same hour, same slow sip while the sky made up its mind about the day. Not because he was lazy. A man who runs 40 acres alone does not know that word. But because Leland had learned a long time ago that the world always shows you something if you sit still long enough to let it. He was 65 years old. Thin, the way a man gets thin from working outside his whole life, all wire and no waste. Dark skin, weathered and cracked at the knuckles, deepened around the eyes from decades of squinting into sun and soil. He wore a dark flannel shirt frayed at the cuffs, faded jeans pale at both knees, a felt cowboy hat that lost its shape 2 presidencies ago, and cracked leather boots he still cleaned every morning before putting them on. His hands were long, ropey, calloused, in all the places a man's hands callous when he has used them for everything, and apologized for nothing. He was a farmer, had been all his life, but Leland's hands knew more than soil. He had rebuilt his own well pump the year the county said it could not be fixed, rewelded his gate frame when the post split in a winter storm, torn down his barn roof and put it back up alone because the quote from town was more than he had. Nobody taught him. He taught himself, by sitting with a broken thing until he understood why it was broken. The kind of man who picks up a dead watch and will not put it down until he has seen every gear inside. He finished his coffee and drove 9 miles to the Ward Estate auction in his old half-ton pickup, with rust climbing both wheel wells. He arrived early, parked at the far end of the lot, away from the clean trucks, walked toward the crowd, and the crowd parted. Not suddenly, just enough. The way water moves away from something it does not want to touch. Nobody said hello. A white man leaning on the fence saw Leland pass and spat into the gravel right in front of his boots. Not at him exactly, but close enough that the difference did not matter. The auctioneer called an opening bid. Leland raised his hand. The auctioneer looked past him, called on someone behind. Leland raised again. The auctioneer paused, squinted, then nodded. The kind of nod a man gives when he is doing you a favor he wants you to remember. A woman near the front pulled her child to the other side of her body as Leland walked past. The child stared, curious the way children are before they learn what they are supposed to fear. The mother tugged harder. Leland saw all of it. He always did. He just never said. While the crowd fought over a drill press and a flatbed trailer, Leland walked to the back of the lot, where the things nobody wanted sat in the weeds. And there it was, a heavy steel shipping crate, sealed shut. Rust had eaten the surface orange and brown, but along the rim of the lid, running all the way around, was a weld seam, thick, deliberate, unbroken. Leland crouched beside it, put on his reading glasses, ran his thumb slow along that seam, the way a man runs his finger under a sentence he wants to read twice. 10 full minutes. No hurry. Just his rough thumb reading something the rest of the yard did not know was written there. Then he stood up, And something in his eyes changed. Not excitement, deeper than that. Like a man who just heard someone speak in a language he thought nobody else remembered. He raised his hand. $60. A silence opened across the lot, the kind that comes right before a crowd decides who to laugh at. And then the laughter came. Burl Keswick did not let it go. A man like Burl never does, because the laughter of a crowd is a drug, and he had just gotten his first taste. He crossed the lot in 4 heavy strides, belly swinging under that tight red polo, gold watch flashing, and planted himself in front of Leland. Close enough that the smell of him, cheap cologne and morning beer, pushed into Leland's space like a second body. $60. He said it again, slower, rolling the number like something rotten. He turned to the men along the fence, one hand pressed flat on the crate lid, right beside Leland's hand, claiming territory. $60 for a sealed box full of rust that even the junkyard wouldn't take for free. He let the crowd catch up, then grinned. I've seen some dumb money in my life, boys, but this might be the dumbest $60 ever spent in this county. The men laughed harder. Not all of them wanted to, but Burl laughed first, and a crowd always follows the loudest voice, because silence takes more courage than most people carry. A man beside Burl leaned in and said something about what Leland probably thought was inside the crate. The kind of joke built on a stereotype so old it does not need to be spelled out. Burl threw his head back and howled, slapped the man's shoulder with a ringed hand, as if rewarding a dog for a good trick. Leland did not move. His jaw tightened once, then released. 65 years of practice had taught him exactly how much a man can swallow without choking on it. Burl leaned down, not to speak to him, to speak over him. His voice dropped to something worse than a whisper, the kind of quiet meant only for the people close enough to hear and too ashamed to repeat. You know where you belong, old man. It ain't here. Leland did not pull his hand away. His cracked boots stayed planted on ground he had every right to stand on, even though every voice in that yard was telling him he did not. The gavel dropped. The crate was his. Then came the people who meant no harm, and they cut deeper than Burl ever could. Roy Suttles, Leland's neighbor, walked over after Burl drifted back to his shiny flatbed. His voice was soft, but the softness was the worst part, because it came shaped like pity. Leland, that's your medicine money for the month. He placed his hand on Leland's shoulder the way a man touches someone in a hospital bed. I'm saying this as your friend. You just threw it away. Leland looked at him, steady, giving nothing. It'll open, he said, and that was all he gave. 2 younger men helped wrestle the crate onto Leland's pickup. One whispered to the other, "Old man's lost his mind." The other snorted in agreement. As he pulled toward the gate, Burl stepped off the curb, not quite blocking the road, but enough that Leland had to tap his brakes. Burl bent to the window, that swollen red face filling the frame. "Drive careful now, Scarecrow." He knocked the roof twice with his ringed hand, the way you knock on something hollow. "Don't let your treasure fall out. I don't clean up after your kind." Leland released the brake and pulled away, hands steady on the wheel. In the rear view, Burl was still filling space with noise, the way empty men always do. He drove 9 miles home at 35 miles an hour, dust trailing behind him, the sealed crate riding heavy in the bed, and not 1 ounce of hurry anywhere in him. There is a kind of patience that looks exactly like surrender, right up until the moment it stands straight and shows the whole world it never once bowed down. The story beat Leland home. By Monday, men who had not visited his farm in years showed up on thin excuses: a gate hinge, a wrench to borrow, just to stand in the doorway of his workshop and look at the sealed crate squatting on the concrete floor. They looked at it the way people look at a car wreck, not to help, but to confirm something had gone wrong. Roy Suttles came that afternoon, stood in the door a long time, arms folded, staring at the crate, then at Leland, then back at the crate, as though one of them owed him an explanation. "Leland, you gave $60 to a thing that won't ever open." He shook his head slowly. "What's gotten into you?" Leland was filing a burr off a clamp. He did not look up. "It'll open." Roy waited for more. There was no more. He sighed the way a man sighs when he has given up on a friend, and walked back to his truck without closing the workshop door behind him. By Wednesday, the name Burl had given Leland was the name the whole diner used. Scarecrow, said warm enough, like a joke between people who all know the punchline, but said all the same. And Burl told the story twice over a plate of eggs, louder each time, adding details that had not happened, shaving away the ones that had. A man at the next table said it plainly, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Somebody ought to tell that old man the crate ain't a coffin yet, but give it time. It's about the right size for him." The table laughed. Burl nodded, chewing, and added without looking up from his plate, "Save his family the cost, too, if he's got any family." He said it the way a man says something cruel and calls it clever. The table laughed again, and no one at any other table said a word. A young waitress behind the counter heard it all. She looked down at the rag in her hands and kept wiping the same spot she had already wiped clean. She did not speak. Nobody did. That is how a small town works. Cruelty does not need everyone to agree. It only needs everyone else to stay quiet. Leland heard about it the way a man in a small town always hears, secondhand, from someone who thought they were being kind by telling him. He did not respond. He had spent 65 years learning that a thing either opens or it does not, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. That week, Leland drove to the only hardware store in town for a wire brush and cutting gas. The owner, a man who did steady business with Burl's scrapyard, looked him up and down from behind the register, eyes moving from the cowboy hat to the cracked boots, and said flatly, "Out of stock." Leland glanced at the shelves behind him. Full. Wire brushes hanging in a neat row. Gas cylinders stacked along the back wall. He did not argue. He stood one beat, then turned and walked out. Drove 40 minutes to the next county and bought what he needed from a man who did not know his name and did not care what color his hands were. He was not angry. He had lived 65 years with doors that closed before he reached them. He simply found another door. But every closed door leaves a mark, even on a man who never lets anyone see where it lands. That night, Leland sat beside the crate in his workshop. Did nothing, just sat. A cup of coffee cooling on the bench beside him. And for the first time, the narrator will tell you what Leland never would. The weight of all of it. 65 years of being looked through, laughed over, turned away. He did not carry bitterness, but he carried tiredness. And there is a difference between a man who feels no pain and a man who has simply stopped expecting it to stop. Then he laid his hand flat on the crate, and what he felt beneath his fingers, that steady, patient, deliberate weld seam, reminded him that someone, somewhere, had trusted enough to seal this shut. And that trust was waiting for the right hands to answer it. Whoever sealed this crate did not seal it against weather. He sealed it against people. To understand what Leland found inside that crate, you first have to understand the man who sealed it. Doyle Pershing opened his machine shop on the Depot Road in the spring of 1933, when the country was on its knees, and a man who could fix things was worth more than a man who could buy them. He was lean, upright, quiet in a way that had everything to do with precision. He could turn a steel part to 1,000th of an inch by feel alone, and never once raised his voice while doing it. For 51 years, the Pershing shop made and mended the things that kept the county running. Pump shafts, gears, broken castings for farmers who could not afford new machines. Doyle never turned a man away for short money, never turned out a part he was not proud of, and never talked about either one. He married late, lost his wife early, and raised one daughter, Ruth, mostly alone in the rooms above the shop, teaching her to read a micrometer before she could ride a bicycle. The town respected Doyle the way a town respects a thing it has always had and assumes it always will, deeply, lazily, and far too late. Then came the partner. In the early 1960s, Doyle was short on cash and long on work. He took on a younger man named Grady Kessick, Burl's father, who put up money for new machines in exchange for half the shop. Grady was a backslapper, a room worker, the kind of man who shakes your hand with both of his and makes you feel important, right up until you check your pockets afterward. He was very good in a room. He was not to be trusted on paper. Over the years, Grady drifted out of the trade and into salvage and scrap, where the money was faster and the work left no grease under the fingernails. The handshake that built the partnership slowly became a stack of documents only Grady had read all the way through. And while Doyle bent over his lathe, doing honest work with honest hands, Grady was quietly rearranging the ground beneath his feet. Then Doyle's hands began to shake. His eyes dimmed. And Grady Kessick, who had been circling for years, began to wait the way a patient animal waits. Not moving, barely breathing, just watching the old man slow down. Doyle died on a January night in 1984, alone in his shop, 79 years old. The town buried him, said the right things, and went home feeling like they had done enough by saying so. Within a month, Grady produced a document, a second partnership agreement, signed and dated, giving him not half the shop, but all of it. The building, the land, the bank account. 51 years of a man's life signed away on a single page. It left Ruth with the furniture and the funeral bill. Ruth Pershing Lanham was 53 by then, tired, dignified, with her father's careful hands and none of his luck. She looked at the paper with her father's signature and saw something underneath that did not sit right. The way the ink pressed too hard in places, as though a shaking hand had been guided. She knew. But knowing is not proof, and the law is an expensive country for a poor woman to go looking for justice in. No money for a lawyer, no witness, no evidence. Grady had a piece of paper with a dead man's name on it, and that was enough. The shop was emptied, the estate was auctioned. Grady took everything inside the walls Doyle had touched for 51 years. Then Grady died a few years later. Heart gave out the way it does in men who carry things they should not have taken. Burl inherited the scrapyard, and he inherited the forged paper. He knew it was not clean. A son always knows what his father's hands were capable of. But he kept it and built his empire on stolen ground and never looked down. The auction where Leland bought the crate was Burl's auction. Burl organized it. Burl profited from it. And the sealed crate sat in the back among things nobody wanted, because Burl was the kind of man who weighed steel and never once wondered what was written on it. Inside, it was the last thing Doyle Pershing ever sealed with his own hands. And the reason he sealed it was something Leland was about to find out. Leland did not rush at it. A man who has spent his whole life sitting with broken things until they tell him why they are broken does not grab a torch the first night and cut. For 3 evenings, He only looked. He sat on the concrete floor with a wire brush and his reading glasses low on his nose, and worked the rust off the weld seam, 1 inch at a time. Slow, careful strokes, the way a man cleans dirt off a gravestone to read the name beneath. The orange scale fell away, and underneath the weld appeared, clean, unbroken, deliberate. A single bead run from lid to body, all the way around, with no gap, no skip, no hesitation. On the second evening, headlights swept across the workshop window, and a heavy engine idled in the driveway. Leland knew the sound of Burl Keswick's flatbed, the way a man knows a storm he has heard before. Burl walked through the open door without knocking. The way a man enters a place he has decided does not deserve the courtesy of permission. He stood in the doorway, belly filling the frame, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, and looked around the small workshop with the slow satisfaction of a man confirming everything in here, including the man on the floor, was beneath him. "Still playing with your treasure, Scarecrow?" Leland did not stand up, did not turn around. Burl crouched, as much as a man his size can crouch, and rapped his knuckles twice on the crate lid, gold ring clinking against the steel. "Tell you what, I'll give you $10 for it right now." He held up both hands, palms out, like a man offering charity to a child. "That way you only lose 50 instead of 60. I'm doing you a kindness here, old man." Leland looked at him for the first time that evening. Calm, level, the way a man looks at weather he cannot change. "Not for sale." Burl laughed through his nose. He straightened, looked around the workshop, the dim bulb, the rusted tools, the cracked workbench, and shook his head. "Makes sense. This box is probably the most valuable thing in the whole house." The words landed exactly where they were aimed, not just at the crate, but at every square foot of the life Leland had built around it. Burl turned his back, walked out, and did not bother to close the door behind him. Leland sat still, listened to the flatbed pull away. Then he stood, crossed the workshop, closed the door himself, came back, sat down beside the crate, and kept working. On the third evening, with the seam fully cleaned, Leland saw what his hands had already told him. He remembered Otis Fenton, the old blacksmith who had let a 15-year-old Leland watch him work, and over time taught him more about metal than any school could have. "Any fool can lay a weld bead, but a real craftsman reads one. A weld is a man's handwriting on steel, and if you look close enough, you can tell whether he was calm or scared, careful or guessing, taking his time or running out of it." Leland read this bead the way Otis taught him. Whoever sealed this crate had done it with a steady torch and clear purpose. The bead was even, close, unhurried. Not the work of someone trying to hide damage or keep out weather. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had a reason for doing it. Men weld things open. They do not weld things shut, unless they mean for them to stay that way. And unless there is something inside worth the trouble of the seal. The hand that ran this bead had been too unsteady for fine machine work. But with a torch braced and elbows tucked tight, it had still been steady enough to lay one last honest seal. This was the final weld of a dying man, the last clean line he had left in him. A man does not seal a crate like this against weather. He seals it against people. And Leland, who had no idea yet what was inside, felt the back of his neck go cold, with a certainty he could not explain, that he was the first person the dead man had trusted to open it. Simply by being the only one patient enough to try. On the fourth night, Leland decided it was time. He did not announce it, did not call anyone. He walked into his workshop after supper, turned on the overhead bulb, and stood over the crate the way a man stands over a promise he is about to keep. He chalked a careful line around the lid, 1 finger's width inside the weld seam, all the way around, so the torch would take the bead and not the box. Then he set out a bucket of water on his left side and a fire blanket on his right, folded once within arm's reach. Otis Fenton had drilled that into him 50 years ago, the first week the old blacksmith let him touch a cutting torch. Water on your left, blanket on your right, every single time. The day you skip it is the day you need it. Leland had never skipped it. He checked the gas lines, tested the striker, adjusted the tip. Every motion, unhurried, precise, the kind of slowness that is not hesitation, but respect. Respect for the fire, for the steel, and for the man who had sealed it. A little after 8, he struck the flame. The first blue hiss filled the workshop like a living breath, and Leland tipped his welding helmet down. The world behind the dark glass narrowed to a single bright point. The tip of the flame touching the chalk line where the weld began. The first orange spark jumped, then a fan of them, a bright fountain pouring off the steel and bouncing across the concrete like scattered coins. Leland ran the flame slow along the line, no faster than the metal wanted to give. The seam glowed and parted under his hand, a quarter inch at a time, the steel surrendering in a thin, bright river that cooled to black behind him as he moved. His knees ached. His eyes behind the dark glass were not the eyes of a young man. The edges of the flame blurred where they used to be sharp. But his hands, when there was a torch in them, were the same hands they had been at 25. They did not shake. They did not wander. They went where he told them and stayed there. 3/4 of the way around the lid, Leland stopped. He shut off the torch, pushed the helmet up, sat back on his heels in the sudden silence, the workshop ticking with cooling metal, the smell of burnt steel hanging in the air. And for the first time in 4 days, the doubt came. What if there was nothing inside? What if the whole town was right and he was wrong? What if he was exactly what Burl Kessick said he was? An old fool who had paid $60 for an empty box and spent a week talking himself into believing it meant something. He could hear Burl's voice. He could hear the diner. He could hear every laugh, every name, every closed door. All of it stacked up in his chest like a weight he had been carrying without admitting it was heavy. Then he looked at the seam. Even, patient, deliberate, run by a hand that had nothing left but this one last steady act. No man seals an empty box with that kind of care. No man uses his last good weld on nothing. Leland pulled the helmet back down, struck the flame, and finished the cut. A little before 10, the last inch of weld let go, and the lid came free in his gloved hands with a sound like a breath held too long, finally releasing. He shut off the gas, pushed the helmet back, let the steel cool in its own time, the way he let everything in his life happen in its own time. The cooling crate ticked and settled in the quiet, like a clock winding down. When the steel was cool enough to touch, he pulled off his gloves, laid them beside the torch, and lifted the lid the rest of the way by hand. Inside, where the rust had never reached, the steel was dry and clean. The air that came up smelled of old oilcloth and cold iron, the smell of something sealed away from the world for a very long time and kept its secrets the whole way through. There were 3 things in that crate, packed tight so they would not shift, and Leland took them out one at a time. He laid them on the workbench under the single bulb, one at a time, the way a man lays out cards he has been waiting his whole life to see. The first thing was a folder wrapped in oilcloth. Leland unfolded the cloth carefully, brittle at the edges but dry inside, papers clean. 2 sheets. The first was the original Articles of Partnership of the Pershing Machine Shop, dated 1961, signed by Doyle Pershing and Grady Kessick. 1 page, plain language, no lawyer's ink. The agreement was simple. Grady put up cash for new machines. In exchange, he received 1/2 of the business, not 1 inch more, for as long as the shop should run. 1/2. That was all. That was ever all. The second sheet was in Doyle's own hand. Careful, exact. A dated witness statement, signed by Doyle and by Otis Fenton before he passed, swearing that Doyle had signed only one partnership agreement in his life, that any paper claiming to give Grady the whole shop was a forgery, a lie laid over a shaking man's signature, and that the true half of everything was, and had always been, meant for his daughter, Ruth. Leland read it twice. Then he set it down and pressed his palm flat on top of it, as though holding it to the earth, so it could not be taken again. The proof Ruth had needed and never been able to reach had been sealed in steel, 9 miles from her front door the entire time. One winter, one spring, one summer, waiting in the dark for the right hands. The second thing was money. Not in any bank the Keswick family had a hand in. Doyle had stopped trusting those rooms years before his hands went bad. Cash. A thick brick of it, banded in brown paper, 5s and 10s and 20s pressed together so tight the edges had fused with age. 51 years of honest work, saved bill by bill out of parts jobs and repair fees that never made anyone rich, but never made anyone ashamed either. The rainy day account of a careful man who had watched his partner turn slick and kept something back where slick hands could not reach. Leland was no banker, but he had held enough of other men's hard savings to know what he was looking at. The better part of a lifetime's keeping. Enough to hire any lawyer in the state and have plenty left to set a daughter back on her feet. He set the brick down gently and wiped his hands on his jeans out of pure habit, the way a man who has worked with his hands all his life always wipes them before touching something that matters, even when they are already clean. The third thing was a letter. 1 page, folded twice, written in a steady, old-fashioned machinist's hand, sealed in an envelope that said only, in pencil, "To the man with patience." Leland Garris, 65 years old, alone in his workshop a little before midnight, put on his reading glasses under the single bulb and read a dead man's last honest words. Doyle's letter did not waste a sentence. He wrote the way he worked, clean, close, nothing extra. He said that he had welded the crate shut with his own torch because it was the last clean weld left in him, that his hands could no longer hold a micrometer steady, but they could still hold a torch braced tight enough to seal one honest seam. He said that the man who called himself his partner could not lay a bead and never learned, and so would never think to look inside a thing he could not pry open with a crowbar or buy with a handshake. He said that what was in the crate was the truth, and Ruth's half of everything he had ever built. That Grady had a forged paper he was waiting to use, a lie pressed onto a dying man's shaking name, and that it must not be allowed to stand. Find my daughter Ruth. Put this in her hands. Let an honest man undo what a dishonest one did. And at the bottom, one line that Leland read 3 times before he set the letter down. A man's life is not the noise his partner makes over his grave. It is the one true thing he troubled to seal up tight, where only a patient hand would ever find it. Leland folded the letter along its old creases, set it on the bench beside the money and the papers. 3 things that had waited in the dark inside a sealed crate, while a whole town laughed at the man who bought it. He did not move for a long time. The workshop cooled around him. The overhead bulb hummed. Somewhere outside the window, the first gray light of morning was beginning to show above the tree line. Thin, pale, the kind of light that arrives before the sun does, as though checking whether the world is ready for what comes next. He had paid $60 for a sealed crate the whole county said was worthless. And inside it was a dead man's truth, a stolen daughter's inheritance, and a letter addressed to no one but him. Now he had to decide what to do with it. He could have done nothing. That is the part most people skip when they tell this story, but it is the part that matters most. Leland could have closed that crate back up, put the papers on a shelf, set the money somewhere safe, and gone back to his life. An old black man with $60 in a rusted box, no connection to the Pershing family, no stake in another family's grief, no reason to walk back into the teeth of a town that had just finished laughing at him. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have blamed him. But Leland was not the kind of man who finds a thing that belongs to someone else and sets it on a shelf. Monday morning, he wrapped everything back in the oilcloth. Careful, tight, nothing shifting. Set the bundle on the passenger seat of his truck and walked across the road to Roy Suttle's feed store. Roy looked up from the register. Something was different about Leland that morning. Not taller exactly, but straighter, like a man carrying something that had given his spine a reason to hold. Roy, where did Ruth Pershing Lanham move to? Roy blinked. 2 counties over. Little place off Route 9, past the feed mill. He paused. Why? I need to bring her something. Roy waited for more. There was no more. He wrote the address on a receipt, and Leland folded it into his shirt pocket and walked out. He drove an hour and a half, past 2 county lines, past fields owned by people he had never met. The bundle sat on the passenger seat, and he kept one hand near it the whole drive. He found the house. Small, white paint peeling at the corners, a porch that sagged on one side, empty flower pots along the rail. The kind of house a woman lives in when she has been quietly robbed of everything and is too proud to let it show from the road. Leland walked up 3 porch steps with his cowboy hat in one hand and the bundle in the other. Knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, cautious. The footsteps of a woman who does not get visitors and has learned that surprises are rarely good ones. The door opened 3 inches. A chain pulled tight across the gap. Through it, a face looked at the dark skin, the frayed flannel, the cracked boots, the hat held low, and did not open further. What do you need? Her voice was not unkind, but it was careful, the way a woman alone learns to be careful, and Leland understood it completely. He had stood in front of half-open doors his whole life. He knew what it meant when someone looked at him through a gap and decided how much space he deserved before he had said a word. He did not step forward, spoke through the chain the way a man speaks when he knows he has to earn the next 3 inches. Ma'am, I bought a sealed crate from your father's estate at the auction last week. He paused, letting her hear that he was not in a hurry. He welded it shut himself. There are things inside he meant for you to have. Silence. Long enough that Leland could hear a clock ticking inside the house. Then the chain slid, the door opened, and Ruth Pershing Lanham stood in front of him. 53, tired in a way that sleep does not fix, with her father's exact face, the same careful eyes, the same quiet mouth, the same expression of a person who measures everything to the 1,000th before trusting it. Leland held out the bundle. This is your father's. He sealed it himself. He wanted you to have what's inside. Ruth took it with both hands, held it against her chest before opening it, the way a person holds a letter they are afraid to read, because it might be the answer they stopped hoping for. She opened it on the kitchen table, while Leland stood on the porch. He watched through the screen door as she read the partnership agreement, the witness statement with Otis Fenton's name at the bottom, and picked up the letter in her father's hand. Her fingers trembled. Her lips moved as she read, shaping words she had not seen in her father's handwriting since the day he died. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. She was the kind of woman who had endured so much that tears had to ask permission before they fell. She came back to the door, opened her mouth to speak. Leland put his hat on, nodded once, and stepped off the porch before she could find the words. Because a man like Leland does a thing like that and then gets out of the way of it. He was in his truck and pulling away before Ruth reached the screen door, one hand pressed flat against the mesh, the bundle against her chest, watching a thin old man in a felt cowboy hat drive away, with nothing in his hands and everything he came to do already done. The witness statement was real. Otis Fenton's signature was known to half the county. He had signed enough receipts and church records that his handwriting was as familiar as the man himself. There was no questioning it. Ruth hired a lawyer that week. She could afford one now. When that lawyer set the original agreement beside the forgery, it collapsed. The ink was wrong. The date was wrong. The signature wobbled where Doyle's real hand had never wobbled. One was the truth. The other was a lie that had survived only because no one had ever held the truth next to it. It did not take a trial, but it took more than a settlement. The district attorney opened an investigation, not into Grady, who was dead, but into Burl, who had spent years profiting from property he knew was stolen. Burl had not just inherited the forged paper. He had used it, built on it, pocketed the proceeds of a lie. Burl was ordered to return everything, the shop, the land, the savings, and on top of that, damages, compensation for every year Ruth had been locked out of what was hers. The number was large enough that Burl had to mortgage his scrapyard to pay it. Then came the public record. The court required Burl to sign a written acknowledgement, filed in the county clerk's office, available to anyone, that his family had used a forged document to seize the property of Doyle Pershing's estate. His name, his signature, the word forgery, all entered into the permanent record of the county, where he had spent 48 years building himself into the loudest, richest, most untouchable man in 3 townships. The name Keswick, polished with gold chains and a shiny flatbed and a red polo stretched tight across his importance, now sat in a courthouse file cabinet with the word fraud printed next to it. The contracts dried up after that. Not all at once. That is not how a small town works. Nobody announced a boycott. The farmers and shop owners who had done business with Burl's scrapyard simply stopped calling. One by one, like lights going off in a house at the end of the night. The men who used to laugh at his jokes at the diner found other tables. His regular seat in the corner, where he had told the story of the scarecrow twice over a plate of eggs, was always taken when he arrived. Not by anyone in particular, just taken. Then came the sidewalk. 3 weeks after the county filing, Burl walked out of the courthouse after signing the last of the documents. Heavy, red-faced, redder than usual, and not from drink. He turned the corner, and there, coming toward him on the same sidewalk, was Leland Garris. Leland was carrying a bag of coffee from the general store, cowboy hat on, same cracked boots, same unhurried step. He was not looking for Burl. He was just walking. The 2 men stopped, 3 feet apart. Burl opened his mouth. For the first time in his life, the man who always had something to say, something cruel, something clever, something loud enough to fill any silence before it could ask him a question he did not want to answer, could not find a single word. His lips parted, and nothing came out. The gold chain hung limp against his chest. Leland looked at him. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. The same steady gaze he had always carried. The one the whole town had mistaken for emptiness, and was only now beginning to understand, had been full the entire time. He nodded. The same small nod he gave everyone. The same one he had given his whole life, whether it was returned or not. Then he walked on. Burl stood on the sidewalk, watching a thin black man in a worn cowboy hat walk away from him with nothing to prove. And he understood, for the first time, what he had never understood at the auction, that Leland Garris had never been beneath him. Not once, not ever. Within a year, Burl sold the scrapyard at a loss. No one wanted to pay full price for property carrying the Keswick name anymore. He moved his family south. The town did not say much about his leaving, but it remembered. In a small town, remembering is the heaviest punishment there is. The sealed crate that Burl's own auction had sold to the man he despised for $60, the one he had stood 8 feet from and seen nothing but rust, had carried the truth out of a dead man's shop and into the hands of the one person patient enough to open it. Burl weighed steel. Leland read it. And that was the whole distance between the two of them. Ruth Pershing Lanham opened her father's shop again the following spring. She did not make an announcement, did not take out an ad in the county paper. She just unlocked the front door on the Depot Road one Monday morning, turned on the lights, and stood behind the same lathe her father had stood behind for 51 years. She could turn a part to 1,000th of an inch by feel. Doyle had taught her that before she could ride a bicycle, standing on an overturned crate so her hands could reach the controls, his voice behind her calm and exact, trusting her to hear it once. The Pershing machine shop ran again, and the sound of the lathe through the open door that spring was the sound of a thing the town had assumed was gone forever, coming quietly back to life. In the front corner of the shop, behind a pane of glass, Ruth set the rusted crate with its lid cut open, exactly the way Leland had left it, the bright torch line still visible along the seam, the steel still scaled with rust on the outside and clean on the inside. Beside it, a small card with her father's name. Nothing else, just the name, because the crate told the rest. Folks who came in to have a part made would stand at that glass a minute, run a finger near the bright cut line, and ask what it was. And Ruth would tell them, quiet, steady, her father's daughter in every word. Leland Garris went back to his farm and his workshop behind the house. He went on mending the things the world threw away. He took not a cent from Ruth, and would have been embarrassed if offered. That was never why. Otis Fenton's old leather apron still hung on its nail by the workshop door. Leland kept it there. Some things a man keeps not because they are useful, but because they remind him where he learned to be who he is. The next morning, warm, the kind of spring morning that feels like the world has finally decided to forgive the winter, Leland sat on his porch in the same chair he always sat in, cup of black coffee steaming between his hands. Same hour, same slow sip, same view of the soybean field stretching toward the tree line. But this morning, Roy Suttles was walking past on the road, and Roy stopped. He stood at the edge of Leland's yard, hands in his pockets, looking up at the porch. For the first time in as long as either man could remember, Roy did not look at Leland with pity or confusion, or the gentle worry of a friend who thinks the other has lost his mind. He looked at him the way you look at a man you have underestimated your whole life and have only just realized it. Roy nodded. Leland nodded back. Neither one said a word. Neither one needed to. Leland took a sip of his coffee and watched the steam curl into the morning air. The field beyond the porch was the same field it had always been, and the chair was the same chair, and the man in it was the same man. But the world around him had finally caught up to what he had been all along. A man does not weld a crate shut to hide what is worthless. He welds it shut to make sure the right hands are the ones that finally open it. Doyle Pershing knew that. He knew it the night he lit his torch for the last time, hands shaking, eyes half gone, and laid the one clean seal he had left in him around a steel box holding everything he wanted his daughter to keep. He could not trust a lawyer or a bank. So he trusted the steel, and the kind of man who would sit with it long enough to read what was written there. Leland Garris was that man. Not the smartest or the strongest, but the most patient. And in a world full of loud men who weigh things and throw them away, patience is the rarest skill there is. If you had crouched at that auction and felt that weld seam run steady under your thumb, would you have paid $60 and trusted a dead man's sealed crate? Or would you have laughed along with the loud man in the red shirt and let the truth rust shut forever? If you stayed until the end, you already know your answer. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I will see you there.
Bill stood 8 feet from the crate at his old auction and sorrowed. Leland kneeled down, ran his thumb along a wheel seam, and read the dead man's handwriting. Same still, 2 different men. Dodd didn't trust lawyer or bank. He just a wheel seam and kind of man patient enough to read it. Sealed the crate, knowing most people would laugh at whoever paid for it. $60 and 4 days of being called a fool. A diner laughed. His neighbor pitied him. Bill knocked on his truck like it were hollow. Every one of them was wrong, not because Leland got lucky, because he stayed when the hardware store said out of stock with full sales behind the counter, stayed when nobody thought he was worth listening to. Real talk, have you ever been the one people look right past, who knows something but can't get anyone to stop laughing long enough to hear it? Or were you in that diner? Whole room? Not one word. Which one were you? Tell me in the comments. Hit the subscribe so we don't miss the next one. A man's life is not the noise other make over his grave. It's the one true thing he chopped to seal up tight. See you there.